One of the most important aspects of backend development are portlets. And so we're going to take some time to take a look at what are portlets, how do they work, and how are they defined by the Java standard. So we're going to head over and take a look at what are the main objectives that we're going to be taking a look at. So when dealing with portlets, in this chapter, we're going to be understanding, well, how do portlets exactly work and how do portlets run their own portlet lifecycle. From there, we'll take a look at how do we create a regular Java standard portlet. And then from there, we'll take a look at how do we set the various attributes and properties of portlets. So we're starting off with Java standard portlets, right? These are portlets defined by the whole committee dedicated to making the portlet standard. So no Liferay flair for the most part. We're also going to be covering the portlet lifecycle as well. So we'll take a look at that along the way. So first and foremost, why do portlets even matter? Portlets have been around for a long time. Might be one of those terms that might seem out of fashion or out of date. But portlets are important because when we develop applications within Liferay, we rely on portlets to implement the controller and the view layer of the application as a whole. Typically, when we develop applications in Liferay, we're going to be following the MVC design pattern. So portlets takes care of 2/3 of what needs to be done. So not only that, but portlets are kind of the cornerstone and the foundation of Liferay as a whole when we're developing apps. So in order to really take off, really develop for the backend, we really need a strong understanding and a good foundation when dealing with portlets. So first and foremost, what is a portlet? Portlets, back in the day, we always defined them as just web applications. In the transition here from previous versions of Liferay to Liferay DXP 7.0 and 7.1, we think of them as web components or the UI aspect of the application. Right? When dealing with a portlet as an application, there's a number of attributes that go along with it. So portlets are going to be running inside of a portlet container, very similar to how servlets run inside of servlet containers. Portlets are going to be the UI aspect within Liferay or within our applications. So they're always going to have a user interface. And then finally, portlets are defined by specific portlet standards or portlet specifications. So right now there are 3 of them: the JSR 168, 286, and 362. So to keep it short, we just call it like portlet spec 1, 2, 3. So let's see how portlets kind of work on a page as we see with this diagram here. So we can have a user interacting with a web page that is created within Liferay. And that web page can actually be made up of different portlets. So you can have a header banner, which is actually a portlet behind the scenes, a footer, and then maybe some other apps on the page. Each one of these different portlets are on the page that kind of play nicely with one another. So let's say we're interacting with portlet B. So we're making a request to portlet B to do something. And so that request is actually going to be transferred over to Liferay and in turn the portlet container when the portlet's going to be. So the portlet container will process the request and then say, hey, portlet B, we got this request for you to do something. So go ahead and do it. And then portlet B will process and then send out a response back to the portlet container, and it goes back up the chain to where the result or the response would be displayed to our end user on the page. And that can rinse and repeat for each one of our other portlets as well. So the portlet container is the one responsible for making sure that each one of our portlets are playing nicely with one another. So let's go into a little bit more detail on some of the things that the portlet can do. So let's say the user again makes a request over to portlet A to do something, and that something involves a service call to one of Liferay services. So maybe in portlet A, we're doing something like, let's say, creating a user. So we're saying, hey, portlet A, I'm making a request to create a user. Portlet A then makes a service call to one of Liferay's services to where it'll then create the user within the database, as well as making sure that that user is indexed so we can search for that user. Alternatively, you can have portlet B down here towards the bottom make a service call outside of Liferay. So using something like a REST service to call maybe your own services that you've created internally, or maybe make a service call to a third-party application, for example. All of this is being done thanks in part to portlets. So practically, when we're on a page within Liferay, portlets are kind of like what we see here. So you have the alerts up at the top right, you have the RSS publisher, and then you have this hello world, and then the blogs. You'll notice it's kind of faint, but you'll see kind of this gray box around each one of those headers that we see. So that gray box is, or the gray line, is distinguishing each individual portlet. So you have the alerts portlet within its own little box, RSS, and so on. So these are known as portlet windows, but I personally call them portlet boxes. So portlet windows. Portlets can also exist within the control panel as well. So portlets can be on a web page. Portlets can also exist inside of the control panel. So two different places that they can be located. So when we're creating a portlet, there are a couple of key building blocks in order to make them. This is again using the Java standard. When we head over to the Liferay world, we'll see some differences here. So all Java standard. So one of the key aspects of creating a portlet are these descriptor files. So we have a web XML and a portlet XML. The important one here highlighting the portlet XML as the portlet's deployment descriptor. All of the settings, attributes, and info about the portlet is typically contained within that portlet.xml. In order for the portlet to run, we're going to need a portlet class or a Java class that implements the portlet interface. The portlet class is kind of like the engine that makes the portlet run. And then finally, we talked about how portlets are typically used as a UI aspect. So we'll use JSPs to display something back over to the end user, as well as have these things called portlet modes, which helps us display different JSPs for different situations. So those are the key building blocks of portlets. Next up are the key aspects or the key concepts of portlets. So the biggest, the most important one we're going to cover first is going to be the portlet lifecycle. So we've talked about how there is a lifecycle for bundles. There's also a lifecycle for portlets. So each lifecycle will have a specific characteristic that affects what the portlet does or maybe doesn't do. From there, we'll talk about portlet modes as a way of displaying different perspectives or different JSPs. And then finally, we have these things called window states or window state. So you can minimize, you can maximize, or you can have a normal point of view. And finally, the last two key concepts is what we call inter-portlet communication, right? How do portlets talk to each other? And one of the ways is through the mechanism known as events. So let's first tackle the portlet lifecycle. So the portlet lifecycle comes in 6 different phases. We're going to use this diagram over here on the right to highlight all 6 kind of at the same time, but I'll be pinpointing specific ones as we progress through. So 6 phases from init, action, event, render, resource serving, and destroy. So we'll cover each one individually and talk about what they do and how they work. So first and foremost is going to be the init phase. So the init phase is going to be called when we first deploy or initialize our portlet. So, deploy the portlet into Liferay. As it's being deployed, it's first going to hit its init phase. So the init phase is typically used to instantialize some parameters or set up some one-time connections between the portlet and whatever it's going to be connecting with. From there, the init phase will then be finished. Now, with each one of these lifecycle phases, there is a Java method that corresponds with it. So the Java method that corresponds with the init phase is the init method. And this phase is only ran one time when we deploy our portlet for the first time. The next phase is the render phase. Now, technically speaking, the render phase is going to generate some HTML fragment or HTML markup, and the summation of all of the other portlets and their HTML fragments or markups is going to be the page as a whole. Now, functionally, what we see in the UI is whenever we want the portlet to be displayed, we need to call the render phase. So every portlet that we see on a page has had to have gone through the render phase in one point in time. Otherwise, we don't see the portlet. Now, the render phase is part of what we like to call the request response lifecycle. So we call it that because here in the render phase, there are two wrapper objects that helps us manipulate what's going on within the render phase, the render request object and the render response object. And just like with the init phase, there's also a method that corresponds with the render phase. It's the render method. So in calling the render method, it's usually two parts. We're going to have one part JSP, one part Java code. So over on the JSP side is where we open up the ability to call the render phase through some sort of URL. So JSP displays a render URL, and then the end user clicks it. When the end user clicks the render URL, the render phase is going to be invoked. And then over on the Java side, the render method, again being the engine, is going to make the render phase work and all the fun stuff that it has to work through. So JSP has a render URL. We might display it as an anchor tag, for example. End user clicks the link. It'll then call the render method over in our portlet class or Java class. When we click to that render URL, it quite literally generates a URL. And these URLs are pretty long because within the URL is a number of different parameters. For example, you'll see the portlet ID, the portlet that is initializing the call, is in the URL. It's the blogs web or the blogs portlet. You'll see the lifecycle that's being invoked. You'll also see a number of other attributes here. The portlet URL quite literally generates a URL that has the parameters of the render phase within it. So the render phase looks a little bit something like this. So we start off by making a render request, and then the portlet container is the one who gets the render requests and looks at the render URL. It'll then see, oh, hey, this render request is going to be sent over to this specific portlet. So I'm going to make this portlet go through its render phase. So here, portlet A's render phase is being invoked. It'll then call the render method, go through the process that it does, and then generates that HTML fragment and sends it back to the portlet container. Now, generally speaking, not all the time, but generally speaking, when we go through the render phase, all of the other portlets on the page is also going to go through its render phase. So we see the same thing happening for portlet B as well as portlet C. So each one of the portlets on the page goes through the render phase, sends its HTML fragment to the portlet container, and the portlet container is the one who's responsible for collecting all of that and sending it back to our end user as the HTML markup or the complete page. Next up is the action phase. Now the action phase does just that. It allows us to provide an opportunity to perform some actions, whatever actions we may want. Now typically this is going to be triggered by a form submit, so the HTML form submit. Now during the action phase, this is where we as developers get to have a lot of fun, right? This is where a lot of our logic is going to come into play. So let's say, I create an application that within the application, I'm going to create something. This is probably going to be done through the action phase. So a lot of our code will end up in the action phase in one way or another. Now with the action phase, we can also trigger events. Now the event phase we'll talk about a little bit later, but just keep that in the back of your mind for now. The action phase can trigger events. Now, one of the interesting things about the action phase is after the action phase is done, the render phase is going to be invoked afterwards. So if you look over here on the diagram on the right, the method that corresponds with the action phase is process action. We have the opportunity to call or trigger events that's handled by the process event method. Now, if there are no events, then we can ignore the process event. So action followed by render, that pattern is always going to happen. And so a common question that comes up is, well, why? Why is it that we want the render phase to always be called after the action phase? And this is actually a pretty good thing, pretty good thinking. So let's say the action phase is manipulating some data in our database. And let's say we have 3 other portlets on the page that relies on the data being manipulated. So I manipulate the data in the action phase, it's stored in the database, and now each one of my other 3 portlets are now out of date, right? New info is in the database, but my portlets haven't read the database yet. They can read it during the render phase. So render phase is kicked off after the action phase, and then we can read the database to grab the new value. So that's the train of thought, that's the idea behind the action phase calling the render phase afterwards. Any portlets on the page that need information that we manipulated, we can get it. And as mentioned, the action phase has the process action method as the corresponding method for the phase. So a little bit different. Now, how do we call the action phase? It's very similar to how we call the render phase. Over on the JSP side, instead of using a render URL tag, we are now using an action URL tag. In this example, we're going to have a simple form being displayed, and then our end user can enter something within the field and then hit the submit or the publish or the save button, whatever it's going to say. This invokes our form submit, right? And then it's going to call the process action method afterwards. Now within the process action method, it also uses an action request and an action response object. So what we're filling out within the fields are going to be stored within that action request object. Over in our Java class, we get the opportunity to grab those parameters that are set within the action request object. And just as we saw with the render URL, the action URL also generates very long URLs because many of the parameters that are being set are set indeed in that URL. So let's take a look at the flow of the action phase. So the user maybe is filling out a form to create a user, for example. So we're filling out the form, right, entering data in all the fields, and then we click the save or the submit button. So we send a request to the portlet container this is going to be an action request. So the portlet container sees, I see you're making an action request to portlet A. So hey, let's tell portlet A to go through and call its process action method. So calls the process action method, does whatever logic is within the process action method, and then it sends the response back to the portlet container. Portlet container sees, hey, action phase is done. Let's go ahead and for each portlet on the page, let's go ahead and call the render phase. So portlet A, portlet B, and portlet C all go through the render phase together, or as together as we can make it. So the page refreshes, all of the portlets re-render, and then we get the markup or the HTML back at us. So the render phase and the action phase are very pivotal, are very essential to the portlet lifecycle. They oftentimes go hand in hand, and we're going to be using them a lot. Now, the next couple of phases, let's go ahead and talk about those. So the next phase we're looking at is the event phase. So the event phase is triggered during the action phase. And the event phase is used for IPC, or inter-portlet communications, a means of having portlets talk to each other. So the way events work is we have one portlet who's going to be setting the event. So they can set the event within the action phase of itself. We can have other portlets registered to listen for a specific event, right? Once that event is triggered, right, they can then take an event object and then do something with it. So over in the diagram on the right, this is the complete flow. So process action will set the event. The portlet or portlets configured to listen for the event will then call its own process event method. Once the process event method has finished, we can then call the render method once again, or the render phase, so that all of the portlets on the page will re-render and they can get the most up-to-date information. Just as with the render and the action phase, the event phase also has a request object as well as a response object. And the process event method is the method that is used over in the Java side. So let's take a look at how does the event phase get called. So the event phase here in this example, we'll start off with portlet A here on the left-hand side. So portlet A is the one who is publishing the event or setting the event or producing the event. So we can see that over on the last line within the property element of the component, we see that this portlet is the one who is publishing the event called www.liferay.com. Over on portlet B on the right-hand side, we see at the last line of the property element that portlet B is the one responsible for processing the event www.liferay.com. So back over at portlet A on the left-hand side, we see in the process action method that we're going to be setting the event. So we see the action response object dot set event. We have a queue name so that we can specify which event we're going to set, and then we can have a message within the event object. So long story short, portlet A sets the event, and once the event is set, over in portlet B, we see the annotation at process event. So over in portlet B, it's listening for a specific queue name. That's how we're going to be defining our event. So once that specific queue name is set, we can then call the method that corresponds with our process event, right? Take the event object and then do whatever it is that we want to do with it. So how does the event phase work? So again, portlet A is the one who sets the event. Portlet B is the one who is configured to listen for a specific event. So the user makes a request over to portlet A, and it's going to invoke the action phase of portlet A. Just as we saw in the diagram previously, portlet A will then set the event in the response object. So the portlet container will see, oh hey, an event has been set. This is the event that's set. Portlet B is configured to listen for that specific event, and once it's set, it'll then go through its process event phase, or I should say the process event method, do whatever it is that we want to do with it, and then we're done. Again, once the event phase is finished, we will then re-render. So one last phase is the resource serving phase. And so another common question that comes up is, well, action phase, render phase, that's cool and all, but do we have to always do that? What if I want to dynamically get information? Do I have to get it and refresh? If I'm always refreshing, that doesn't provide the best user experience. And so we have another phase called the resource serving phase, or the serve resource phase. What's cool about this is this lifecycle phase stands independent from everything that we just talked about for the most part. So by calling the resource serving phase, no other lifecycle method is going to be invoked. So there's no re-render, there's no action, right? There's nothing but the resource serving phase. So this phase does just as we described. We're able to serve resources. Now, typically speaking, we're going to be using this for AJAX calls. All right, so a couple of different use cases for the resource serving phase. A cool one that sometimes we take for granted is the autocomplete. So we're typing something in a field, and then that window below the field shows up, giving us a couple of suggestions based off of what we're typing, right? Another one could be getting content within a portlet without having to refresh, right? Again, kind of classic in social media, right? Whenever we get a specific notification, right? The whole page doesn't just refresh, right? We get a little indicator letting us know that we got something new, right? Continuous loading of feeds, right? Always getting the most up-to-date within a specific feed, whether it's a social media feed or something within your intranet, for example, or pretty much anything that we want to do behind the scenes without having to refresh our page. So how does this all work? So in this example here, just as the previous ones, we still have the JSP over on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side is going to be our portlet class. So over on the left with the JSP, we have this resource URL. And the resource URL has what we call a var that's connected to it. Easy way to be able to reference the resource URL itself is through that var. And so what's going to happen is we have an anchor tag. And when we click on that anchor tag, right, it's going to be calling this JavaScript function fetch data. Now, to keep it a little bit simple here, fetch data is going to be called, and within the fetch data, we see the resource request URL. So JavaScript function is called. It's going to call our resource URL or invoke the resource serving phase. So then over on the Java side, the serve resource method is called. It does its thing to get the data that it needs to get, right? Puts it within a JSON object, passes it back off, back over on the JSP side, right? We then finish through the fetch data method, right? Displaying the JSON that was generated over in the Java side. And last but not least within our portlet phases is the destroy phase. So the destroy phase is analogous to uninstalling a portlet. So when we undeploy our portlet, this is when the destroy phase is called. So any sort of cleanup, any sort of disconnecting, anything that we want to get rid of as we're uninstalling our portlet, this is what the destroy phase is going to do. And so the destroy phase has the destroy method that corresponds with it. So that covers our portlet lifecycle. So again, we have 6 big lifecycle phases. The 2 that we're really going to hone in on within our examples is going to be the render phase and the action phase. Now, moving on, we're going to be talking about portlet modes. So portlet modes here provide for us different operation modes or different points of view depending on what we want to do. And so the portlet specification gives us 3 different portlet modes that we can work with. We have the view mode, we have the edit mode, and we have the help mode. These 3 different modes. Each one is given to us so that we can provide a different point of view for that specific situation. So if we want to configure something for the portlet, for example, we can enable the edit mode, and the edit mode will have a JSP that corresponds with it. Or maybe we want to provide some help message in regards to our portlet. We can have the help mode display a specific JSP that corresponds with that. Of the modes though, the only one that we need for certain is the view mode. The view mode is the default mode that the portlet will render or display as. Liferay has provided some additional modes as well, right? There's a lot of different situations in which we may want to display something or be able to toggle over. So Liferay has provided a couple of extra modes as well. Things like about mode or a print mode, or maybe a preview mode, or any of the other ones here that are listed. Now jumping back to the main 3, the view, edit, and help, each one of these portlet modes has a specific method that corresponds with it. Now, the implementation of the Java standard, JSR 168, 286, or 362, is within a portlet class called generic portlet. So we talked about the portlet class being the engine that runs the portlet. It's generic portlet that is the Java representation of the portlet specification. And so over in generic portlet, they provide us with 3 methods that we need to implement: do view, do edit, do help. Each one of these methods is what will ultimately allow us to switch to that mode. So when I'm in the view mode, the portlet will call do view to render the portlet in the view mode. If I in the edit mode, same idea. The portlet will then call the do edit method to try to render the portlet in the edit mode, and the same for every other mode that we have. So this is all going to be done during the render method. So the render method is going to determine which mode we are in and then call the method that corresponds with the mode. So all of this is done, or all of this is dispatching. So how can we set these different portlet modes? We got a couple different options. First option is we can do it within the JSP, just saying, hey, the portlet mode that I want is this. Or we can also do it in our portlet class as well. You can see here with the action response, we set the portlet mode to the edit mode. We know after the action phase, render phase will follow afterwards. It'll be during the render phase that it'll see, oh hey, the portlet mode has been set to edit, so let me call the do edit. Now the render method itself over in generic portlet can be a little bit complicated. So the long story short here is most of the time when we call the render method, the do dispatch method is what's going to be called afterwards. Right? There's a couple of situations where that's not going to be the case, but most of the time, just to simplify this conversation, we're going to be calling do dispatch afterwards. So render phase is invoked, render method is called, the render method will call do dispatch. Over here in do dispatch, what we're trying to do is figure out which portlet mode we are in. Right? So once we figure out which portlet mode we are in, we will then call the method that corresponds with it. Again, that's kind of a simplified version here. If you want to take a look at this or any of the code previously, feel free to rewind, pause, and take a look. Again, we're trying to keep things a little bit more high level here. Now, next part of the conversation is window states. So we've talked about the life cycle. We talked about the portlet modes. Next up, it's going to be window states. So with window states, we have 3 different states that the portlet can be in. We have normal, maximized, and minimized. So the first state that we have is normal. So as soon as we put a portlet on a page, it's in its normal point of view. Now each one is the way it sounds. So we can have maximized, and this typically makes the portlet take up the whole page. So the whole page is just going to be the portlet when it's maximized. Minimized is going to collapse the portlet so that's just a title bar, nothing more. So it's not actually going to display anything, but just that title bar across the screen, or in its little section, I should say. And just like with our portlet modes, window states can be invoked or set in the JSP side, as well as the Java side, our portlet class. All right, so almost home free. We have a few more concepts to talk about. Next one is inter-portlet communication. Again, I like to call it IPC for short. So IPC comes in 2 separate flavors. We have public render parameters and events. We talked about events a little bit ago, so let's go ahead and talk about public render parameters. Now, public render parameters, you can define them, or you can have the definition in the name itself. It is a parameter coming from the render object that's public. That's a public render parameter. Of course, there's a lot more detail to that. So let's dive into some of the details. Now, one of the analogies that we make with public render parameters is something like a global variable. Now, don't think about analogies too much because they eventually break down, but it's a good comparison. So public render parameters, these are parameters that can be accessed and manipulated anytime during the portlet lifecycle. So what we can do is we can set the public render parameter at any time, and we can also read it pretty much at any time. When we're creating these public render parameters, they need to be uniquely identifiable via a namespace. So that way we don't have all of these different parameters colliding or conflicting with each other. So parameter that's public, read during the render phase, or manipulated during any of the lifecycle phases. And one of the common use cases of public render parameters within Liferay are Liferay's tags and categories, a way to add metadata to our content. Let's talk a little bit more about how these public render parameters work. So over in portlet.xml, we define a public render parameter, right? We say this is the specific public render parameter that I want to support. It's called tag. Now we can do some unique identifiers to the tag public render parameter by using a Q name. So we have that Q name there tacked on to our public render parameter. So this portlet, called training portlet, is supporting the public render parameter called tag. Now, from here, there's a lot of different things we can do with it. So for example, over on the JSP side, you can manipulate the public render parameter by filling out a field and then invoking the action URL of the form. So manipulate the tag or the public render parameter, right? Hit a save or submit button. And then over on the Java side, we can then set the parameter, or I should say, what we can do next on the Java side is we can retrieve that tag parameter and do something with it, whatever that something may be. Now, there's a couple of other ways in which we can go through inter-portlet communication. These are non-standard ways, so we don't really talk about them all too much. But if you are interested, the web does have more details, but we at Liferay, we don't necessarily use these. More of an FYI. So let's talk about this a little bit. So portlet sessions by default are private. So the portlet session and all of the info of it is usually within just the portlet itself. We can set a specific attribute, private session attributes to false, so that way it opens up the session to other portlets so that they can retrieve it. Client-side IPC is legacy. This is basically leveraging different JavaScript libraries out there to help us to communicate with portlets on the page. Right. So here's an example here where we have a sender and a receiver. So the sender can send specific parameters over to the receiver, and the receiver can then do something with it. Again, these two examples here are non-standard. So if you are to use inter-portlet communication, the two big ways, the two supported ways are public render parameters and events. Now, this has been pretty long, so let's go ahead and wrap this up a little bit. So a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. So we have the action phase and the render phase as the two big phases we're really going to hone in on. The action phase is always going to call the render phase afterwards. So keep that in mind. Right. The render phase is going to produce HTML fragments. So this is going to be helping us create our web pages. There's no sort of redirection during there. Where we're dealing with the window state of a portlet, this is only set within the action phase. So if you want to set the window state, you have to have the action phase there, right? And then you can't pass parameters from the action phase to the render phase by specification. So the JSR, or the Java standard portlet, says no, but we at Liferay, we kind of manipulated it a little bit so that you can. So this is the sort of long story short about portlets. We can spend all day, a whole week talking about it, but this is all of the big information that we need in order to really get our hands dirty in the back end. So with all of that, we have Java standard portlets. Next up, let's see how these Java standard portlets come into effect when we throw in some Liferay flair into it.